Welcome. Welcome all. I'm Laura Steinberg. I'm the Seidner Executive Director of the Schiller Institute for Integrated Science and Society here at Boston College. We're very happy to have you here today for our third Schiller Distinguished Lecture event of the year. This is a series in which we bring world-renowned scientists in the areas of energy, environment, or health to the university to offer insights from their work in a way that is accessible to all for the students, faculty, and staff in the Boston College community. Now, we appreciate that some of you managed to find your way over here from 245 Beacon. We're thrilled because we needed to have a larger venue because this talk was so well subscribed. And I think we'll all realize how smart we were to come to this talk, even if we walked across campus, because I think it's going to be a terrific one. Our format today will be a talk of approximately 40 minutes, followed by about 20 minutes of questions and answers. Following this, we'll be serving lunch back at 245 Beacon. That's room 501 in the Schiller convening space. And if you're not sure where that is, just follow the crowd over there. We do hope that you'll stay for lunch, if your schedule permits your doing so. Because if you stay for lunch, you'll first be able to enjoy a chat with other attendees, and because our speaker will be at the lunch with us and will be interested in talking with you and hearing from you and discussing science with you. So I mentioned this is our third Schiller Distinguished Lecture event of the year. I wanted to remind you of the previous two that we had this year. Earlier this year, we featured Philip C.A. from the Global Carbon Project. Philip spoke about the destabilization of the natural carbon cycle as a result of climate change. And then you may recall, some of you may have been here for V. Balaji from Schmidt Sciences, who spoke about the evolution of climate modeling from the 1940s to the current day. But now, I am honored to introduce this afternoon's guest, Professor Moungi Bawendi, the Wolf Professor of Chemistry at MIT and the recipient of the 2023 Nobel Prize in Chemistry, along with his fellow awardees Louis Bruce and Alexei Ikovov. Now, you can see the official diploma for the Nobel on this slide. In the spirit of the liberal arts that we like to infuse in all of our distinguished lecture talks at the Schiller Institute, and that we like to infuse in all that we do at the Schiller Institute, I wanted to share this original artwork by Lars Larsen with you on this diploma that Professor Bawendi received with his Nobel Prize. Professor Bawendi and his colleagues won the Nobel Prize in 2023 for their groundbreaking work with nanocrystals. As the Nobel News release stated, the nanocrystals that Bawendi produced were almost perfect, giving rise to distinct quantum effects. Because the production method was easy to use, it was revolutionary. More and more chemists started working with nanotechnology and began to investigate the unique properties of quantum dots. Now, the importance of quantum dots may be a mystery to some or many in the audience. And I know that one topic that Dr. Bawendi will talk about today is to explain what they are and why they matter. But in addition, I'm looking forward to Dr. Bawendi sharing insights on being a scientist, drawn from his own experiences as an undergraduate at Harvard, as a PhD student at the University of Chicago, and as a postdoc at Bell Labs, where he worked with fellow Nobel Prize recipient Louis Bruce on the development of quantum dots. And of course, his experiences as a professor at MIT. Along the way, Dr. Bawendi may well touch on the importance of interdisciplinary research, a topic near and dear to the Schiller Institute, as he shared with me how his own work touches on chemistry, material science, electrical engineering, and other areas of science. So it is my great pleasure and my great honor to introduce Dr. Moungi Bawendi for our distinguished lecture speech today.
I'm really delighted to be here. Of all the places I've been, this is the closest to my house, probably. So this is an easy commute. So I'm going to give you a talk, and I'll try to touch on some of the topics that we've already talked about. The talk is geared to a general audience, public lecture, so I'm not going to go deep into the science. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my trajectory as well as what these quantum dots are. So let me begin by telling you. Let's see. There we go. Let me tell you a little bit about myself, because my journey, my personal journey, also impacted my scientific journey. So I was born in Paris, and my father is Tunisian. My mother is French. And growing up in Paris, I was neither Tunisian nor French. I was an outsider. Then my parents moved to Tunis, where I was not really Tunisian, I was speak Arabic. And I went to a French school, I was Tunisian. Then we went back to Nice, and then eventually made our way to the United States, in Western Indiana, from Purdue University. And if you replace one letter in Purdue, with the first U with an E, in French it's Purdue, which was lost. 10-year-old, not knowing a word of English, being dropped into this little town, I was very lost. But somehow I survived. We came back to Paris, through my high school years, back to University of West Lafayette, went to Harvard as an undergraduate, University of Chicago as a graduate student, and Bell Labs in New Jersey, and then back to Cambridge, being at MIT. So a lot of being kind of lost, a little bit of an outsider, and I think that made me, as a child, more self-sufficient than maybe an introvert. I needed to not pay too much attention to what others thought about me, and that ended up being useful for my science. Well, here I am going to Tunis first with my parents, and then this is the airport in France, in Orly at the time, getting ready for immigrating to the US, and not believing my mother that they didn't speak French there. Yes,
so it's just a little bit hard to hear you.
Hard to hear. Okay, so let me see. Is this? Oh, I have to turn this on. Okay. That should be on. Is it better? Oh, much better. Okay. And now I'm an American here. Okay, so Harvard University. This was 40 years ago. That's a long time ago, almost 40 years ago. And it was a different time. Harvard was much more peopled by the Northeast, the West Coast. I came from the Midwest, and I really felt like an outsider then. I was really intimidated. I came from a small school, and this was a big university. I took my first chemistry exam, and I was just paralyzed, and I got the lowest grade in the entire class of freshman chemistry, 20 out of 100. And I was like, there was a bird that was flying around the room. There was a prompter, really terrible experience. And it turned out I didn't know how to study. That was the reason why. Because I never had to study hard before. And, but I recovered. I learned to study. I learned how to take an exam, and after that, everything was fine. But that first experience, it was really a wake-up call. Because I really liked chemistry, but I didn't know how to take exams. I learned how to do that. But I loved Harvard after that. I started to do research. I did research on the theories of physical mechanics as an undergraduate. It was great. Moved to the University of Chicago as a theorist. Did more theory, more statistical mechanics. And the kind of statistical mechanics I did at Chicago was polymer statistical mechanics. And in this country, polymer statistical mechanics was done by chemists, but in Europe it was done by physicists. It was really dominated by European physicists. And I really, again, felt like an outsider. I'd go to a conference and I saw these European physicists that were there. And, well, you know, so I decided pretty soon that that wasn't very comfortable a place to be. And I wanted to do experiments. I wanted to work with my hands more as a scientist. So I switched in the middle of graduate school, which is uncommon. Most people stay in the same field in graduate school, and their advisors really doesn't necessarily encourage them to switch. But I did, because I had a fellowship, and I switched to studying high-resolution infrared spectroscopy of molecular species that are important for astrophysical events. So I studied something called H3+, 3 electrons, 2 protons. It's the smallest polyatomic molecule that you can think of, right? And it's very important for chemistry in interstellar medium. It's a source of hydrogen atoms. It's created by cosmic rays and all sorts of things, you know. And it turns out, you know this, but the atmosphere of Jupiter is basically hydrogen, right? So my claim to fame is some of the fundamental studies of H3+ that I did as a graduate student turned out to be helpful for understanding the energy of the impact of a comet that broke apart in the 90s in 3 pieces and exploded in the atmosphere of Jupiter. You could see it on Earth. And from what I did, you could calculate how much energy was expended from the amount of H3+ that was created and how hot that was on the fundamental. So this is the beginning. Today we call that astrochemistry, or different words, and the field of astrochemistry has really exploded in the last few years. Now we can find really complicated molecules in interstellar space, molecules that could be the seeds of life. And I find that extremely fascinating. I get interested by all sorts of things. And the problem that I had with the field, my field at the time, was that it was very established. I loved it as a graduate student, but it was quite mature to my taste. And then I went to Berlin as a graduate student, as a summer student during graduate school in Murray Hill, and I encountered Lou Bruce, who had just discovered the quantum effects, quantum size effect in quantum dots, brand new field, and I fell in love with it because nobody else was working on it, and that just suited me just fine. You know, it was because I didn't like being part of society. I wanted to stay an outsider, and and everything that we studied was brand new because nobody had studied it before. You know, every question we asked was a new question. Every answer was a new answer and generated more questions, and everything was really fundamental. And I just loved that. You know, it was very curiosity driven, and you could really take your knowledge of basic chemistry and basic physics and apply it to something that was new, that was the beginning of nanotechnology, really. That was right at the beginning of engineered nano-materials. We didn't call it that at the time. So then I went from Murray Hill and I came to MIT, which was to me really a wonderful place because of the interdisciplinarity of MIT. Those who've been there, you know that we have an old building that's the centerpiece of MIT, of the campus, where departments are all connected physically because we can walk from one department to the other. The department next to my office at the time was astrophysics. It was wonderful. I had great colleagues there. My students can walk from one department to another without going outside, and it just fosters a lot of interdisciplinary research. It's part of the culture. And at the same time, the engineering school is right there, and if you're working on new materials, you know, it keeps you grounded. It gives you a reality check. We all write in our proposals and our first paragraphs, you know, we're studying this because it could be applied for this and that and that. And most of you have no idea what we're talking about. but the engineers and the Sloan School and everybody around you who really cares about actually commercializing and talking to companies really gets you grounded and you understand what it actually takes to go from a fundamental discovery to something that's a technology, which is what we ended up doing, the field ended up doing in the last 30 years. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. Okay, so what is a quantum dot? I'm going to have to define something. So a quantum dot, it's a nanometer-sized crystal of a semiconductor whose electrons show quantum-sized effects. There's a cartoon of a quantum dot. This is a quantum dot made of two different kinds of atoms. Can't even see in this case here. You usually think of a semiconductor as a piece of silicon, perhaps, as something that's in your computer that powers the logic of the computer. But semiconductors come in all sorts of flavors. You can have binary semiconductors that contain two different kinds of atoms. Cat selenide is one of them. And we consider cat selenide to be the hydrogen atom of quantum dots because it's been so widely studied. Whenever there's a new effect, we go there first, not necessarily for applications, but to understand the fundamental science. It's you can't use a light microscope because it's nanometer size, and the wavelength of light is hundreds of nanometers, so you need something that's less than the size of a nanometer to be able to see it. And so the kinds of waves that you have to use then to interact with the quantum dots to visualize it are electron waves, waves of electrons as opposed to photon waves, which are too big. There's a electron microscope with my student looking at it, and we get these images. These images of quantum dots, in this case here, they are about 5 nanometers in size. They're all just about the same size. And that's the main tool that we're able to use then to be able to know what we need. So those microscopy tools are super important in addition to the spectroscopy, the interaction of the material with light that we use generally to study materials. Okay, so that's the nanometer size. It's a semiconductor. Semiconductor means that in the absence of any energy, there are no free electrons. The electrons are all tied up to the atoms that are part of the material. The atoms are confined to be near an atom, right? As opposed to a metal where the electrons are free to explode the entire metal. But it doesn't take that much energy to free an electron in a semiconductor. Energy you need could be the wavelength of light, right? A little bit of voltage, and free an electron. And if you're talking about a computer, then that freed electron, that liberated electron, is now available to do computation. So that's what we're going to be of interest here: is that electrons that we can liberate to do things by adding a little bit of energy to the material. Okay, now quantum. So ever since I learned about quantum mechanics, I fell in love with quantum mechanics. I think it's an amazing science. It's a description of the world at a microscopic state, which is often extremely counterintuitive. It's really magical, quantum mechanics. And one of the hallmarks of quantum mechanics is that when you get to high energy or small dimensions, that there's this concept of particle-wave duality. Something that you think of as a particle, an electron, actually behaves like a wave, and vice versa. Something that you think as a wave, like light, actually behaves like a particle, like a photon. And so this particle-wave duality is at the heart of the magic of quantum mechanics. So I want to show you an experiment that was done in 1989 in Hitachi that illustrates this duality between particles and wave or electrons, and that's going to be important to understand how electrons behave in quantum dots, the wave-like property of electrons. So in this experiment here, what they did is they took an electron microscope like the one that you saw my student use to image the particles. But in that electron microscope, what they did is they put a little apparatus in there. So there's a voltage in this little wire here. This is a microscopic wire. It's actually less than the width of a human hair. And then a couple plates that are of opposite voltage. And you can generate single electrons that you can think of a particle. So this little tip up here is a high voltage, and every now and then it shoots out a single electron out. And that single electron then sees this apparatus here and has two choices. It can go down one path or the other path, and then it hits a plate here, and when the electron hits the plate, that creates an electrical signal, and you see where it hits. So this is basically a camera for where the electron hits, right? So you have a little high energy electron particle coming out inside this apparatus, and then it becomes a particle hitting this plate, giving its energy to this place, and you count it, you see it on the screen as little bright spots as the electrons hit that plate. In the middle here, because of the dimensions of this apparatus and the energy of the electron, it actually interacts with the apparatus not as a particle, but as a wave, and you'll see that. If it were a particle, which is what your intuition will tell you, that electron gets generated up here, and then it has to pick a path. It's going to go either this way or that way. And then when it hits here, well, maybe you'll see a shadow of this right down the middle here. Then you'll see a bright big spot here and a bright big spot here, depending on where the electron hits. Or maybe you'll see two bright spots where the electron hits. That's what your mind tells you. But there's a choice here, one way or the other. So let's do the experiment. There's the apparatus, and this is the experiment, and so that one electron at a time, just one electron in the apparatus at a time. It's not two electrons, so one electron at a time, and you see then the screen lighting up, and it's going to speed up, otherwise we'll be here and also we'll zoom out a little bit, so speed up, zoom out, you still see this sort of random pattern of electrons coming out. And we're expecting to see two bright spots as it chooses one path or the other. And it's going to speed up again, zoom out a little bit more. It still looks quite random as that one electron at a time hits the screen. If you look very carefully, you're going to start to see a pattern. Pattern is not two spots or two stripes. It's a bunch of stripes. This is not what we expected from that one electron. How do you get a pattern of stripes like this from this experiment? It's because during the middle of the apparatus, that one electron, isn't a particle anymore. It's a wave. Okay? So now what happens to let's do another experiment with waves, right? So I send a wave. Let's say these are waves in an ocean or something at the beach, right? So these are waves coming in, water waves, and I have a pier here, and I've got two holes in there. So these waves are crashing into this pier and coming into these little holes here, and they come out, as the waves become circles as they come out, and these circles start to interact, circles of waves start to interact with each other. Like, you draw two stones on the pond at the same time, and you get this very complicated pattern of waves coming out. So this is what happens here. So this is a high wave here, the strong wave here, and then there's nothing here. Okay. So you get a series of intensity waves here. That's exactly what we see. So that one electron really behaves like this big wave here. It's actually massive, right? You think of this as a little tiny particle coming from this tip, but it becomes this massive wave that sees the entire apparatus all at the same time. And it doesn't make a choice. It doesn't decide, I'm going to go one way or the other. It just crashes into the whole thing. Just like this wave here crashes into the entire thing and goes through both holes at the same time, and then starts to interact with itself. So that electron wave interacts with itself, and then it becomes an electron again. There's a little tiny particle, and we see it as a little spot. And it's not until we do the experiment over and over and over and over again that we see the shape of that wave that was created in the middle. So there's two things about the quantum mechanics here. It's the particle wave duality, which becomes so important, and also the probabilistic aspect of it, the statistical aspect of it, that you need to do that experiment over and over and over again to be able to see the effect of the quantum. And for you, some of you that know a little bit about quantum computing or quantum computers, that's exactly why they're so powerful, because you end up creating these essentially what are these waves, like these complicated shapes, but you have to do the experiment over and over and over and over again to get the final result. All right, so that's the basic idea. So how does that apply to quantum dots? Well, we have to go, again, from the idea that the electron is a little particle, a bar, let's say, which we're used to. What happens when you take that little particle, but not put it in an electron microscope, but rather into a little tiny box? Okay, well, usually you think of quantum mechanics connected with chemistry or with atoms or physics, taking that electron next to a nucleus to create the atom, right? Or in the molecule, where the electron creates bonds between atoms. Without quantum mechanics, you wouldn't have bonds. Right? And you think of these electrons and molecules as being localized, really in very, very small spaces between atoms. But here now we're putting into a nanobox, much bigger than an atom, a box that can contain thousands of atoms. It's a semiconductor. And it turns out that electron in the semiconductor, confined in a little box made up of the semiconductor, behaves like a wave. It sees the entire box, just like electron that we showed before experiment, saw the entire electron microscope. So it sees the entire box as a wave. Now we're used to different kinds of waves, and one of the kinds of waves we're used to are sound waves, right? So now we have a wave in a little box, but we're used to sound waves in cavities. We know how those behave, right? If you take a flute or piccolo, we know that the pitch of the flute is lower than the pitch of the piccolo, and it's just the size of the cavity, right? The wave, the sound wave that fits into that cavity. We can change it by playing up those little holes and slightly changing the cavity to make different notes. But fundamentally, the piccolo is higher pitched than the flute because it's smaller cavity. The same thing for organ pipes. The sound coming through organ pipes is just connected to the size of the cavity. With the small organ pipes being higher pitched and the broad organ pipe lower pitched. And I've put a color-coded the pitch here because this pitch is connected to energy. It's the energy of the sound wave. Because wavelength is connected to energy. So small wavelengths are generally connected to higher energy. So red is lower energy, blue is higher energy, and that's the same thing for light. Blue light has higher energy waves than red light. And it's the same thing with quantum dots. Now look at these quantum dots, and I've got to put an electron in there. Remember, they're semiconductors. They don't have any free electrons unless I do something to it. How do I liberate it? Like, there's plenty of electrons. There's a lot of atoms in there. And every atom here comes with many electrons, but they're all localized right next to the atom. So I've got to liberate that electron. The way I do that is by shining light. I shine UV light. UV light has enough energy in it to liberate one electron, let it be free to now fill the entire box as a wave. So you excite UV light, you let it free an electron, it becomes this wave that now sees the cavity, and that wave electron has different energies depending on the size of the box. Eventually, that electron, that liberated electron, will go back to where it came from. So it was liberated from an atom, right? So it finds the place where it used to be, comes back down. That energy gets liberated now as a wave of light. And wave of light also have the color depends on the energy. So a high energy electron here, the short wave, or electronic wave, becomes light that has higher energy than the big cavity. So that's how we get the different colors of light from the different sizes of these quantum dots. Quantum effect, you shine your UV light, you liberate that electron, it sits in this wave, and you see the different fluorescence colors coming out. And to me, that was always amazing, and it's still amazing that what you're seeing is this particle wave duality in quantum mechanics just with your own eyes. You just see it right? And I find that every time I think, wow, that's really cool. Really cool that you can see quantum mechanics. So that's the idea of quantum dots. So the Nobel Prize in 23 was for the discovery and synthesis of the quantum dot. So the discovery was by Lou Bruce and Alexei Ekimov. Louis was working at Bell Labs, and Alexei Ekimov was working in Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, in Leningrad. And let me tell you a little bit about Alexei first. So Alexei, he came to discover the effect of quantum effects in these small particles through an interest in the color of stained glass windows in churches. So it was already known that the red color in stained glass windows is largely due to really tiny particles of gold. So if you make gold really small, like nanometer size, it's no longer yellow, but it's red. And Faraday knew that back in the 1700s, late 1700s. The gold colloids, we call them colloids, they dispersed in water or solvent. The gold colloids that Faraday studied, there are still samples in the UK, Cavendish laboratories. And that was known, but what about the other colors, right? You know, are they different metals? And so Alexei went to the recipes of the old, empirical recipes made largely of many things that don't provide color, but rather provide the ability to work the glass. And if you get rid of all those atoms and just keep the ones that are important, for instance, cadmium and selenium, or cadmium and sulfur, or copper and chloride, you form the glass and you heat it up and lower the temperature in different ways, you can change the color of the glass, even though they all have the same atoms in there, the same impurities in there. So he was able then to use a technology called X-ray, small angle X-ray diffraction, which allows you to measure the size. So X-rays are really tiny, they're sub-nanometer size. So you can use them to essentially image the size of nanometer particles. So the wavelength of the X-ray is smaller than the size of those particles. So we use small angle X-ray to measure the size of the particles and correlated then the color with the size and discovered that this was quantum effect. Quantum size effect. And he wrote a paper in 1981 in the Soviet literature, and the first three words, quantum size effect. Now that was a time where there was very little contact between Soviet scientists and Western scientists. There was Iron Curtain. It took about 3-4 years for the Soviet literature to get translated to English, and very little back and forth. During the same time, Lou Bruce was working at Bell Labs. This was a time of an energy crisis. The OPEC embargo. I was here in the US as a student at Harvard, Carter administration. There were lines of car waiting to, pump gas. Even days for even number of license plates and non-days and all that stuff. Different time. There was the creation of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So there was a big impetus to try to figure out how to harness the sun to create fuel, something that we're very much aware of again today, right? There was a desert of that interest during the Reagan years, sort of all disappeared. So he was interested in how fast do electrons that were liberated in the semiconductor by sunlight, with energy, how fast those electrons could be transported across an interface into a solution to do photochemistry, to do chemistry to break bonds and to create fuel. And so he wanted to understand how fast that process, the genetics of the process of the transfer of an electron from the solid state to the liquid state, using new technologies that had been invented right around there, which were lasers that had short pulses of the wavelength of the time scale of like picosecond or so, which is the right time scale for measuring this. And if you want to measure this transport of electrons across an interface, you want to have as much interface as possible. So you want as much surface as possible, and so you want to have your surface to volume ratio to be as high as possible. So you take your piece of semiconductor and you make it as small as you can to increase your surface to volume ratio. And so that's what he did. And then he came across this effect, which was that as he made his particles smaller and smaller, every time he made them, they came out differently, with a different color. And he thought it was just a bad experimentalist, which he was a great scholar, but maybe he was not as gifted in his synthetic lab. But he had access at Bell Labs to these electron microscopes, so he was able to look at his particles directly and found that the color was correlated to the size of the particles. He wrote a paper in 1983, not knowing anything about Ectomorph's work, for the first 3 words, quantum size effect. Science has a way of appearing, you know. It's like, it was time. It was time to discover this. Lewis eventually found the paper, the translated paper years later, in the mid-80s, late 80s, from Ekimov, and wrote Ekimov a letter saying, looks like we're working on the same thing. And that letter was intercepted by the KGB. And Ekimov and his team got a visit with the KGB asking, why would somebody in Bell Lab be interested in your work? What's so interesting in your work, you know? It was pretty fundamental. Anyway, Ekimov eventually came to the US. So my contribution was for the synthesis, because it wasn't enough to really understand the physics to have discovered the effect. And what Lewis had started was then an effort to make better samples that were more uniform, so you can really study the material, study the physics of it. The material was good enough that you could see the effect broadly, but you couldn't study the intricacies of the material. So that's why I came. When I was a postdoc at Bell Labs, I had been working on a project, and I accidentally came across a way to make the particles a little bit better by going to higher temperature and going to organic salts as opposed to water. Turns out semiconductors really don't like water. They get oxidized. You start with something that's cadmium sulfide, you end up with cadmium oxide, not at all what you wanted. And then I came to MIT, and I tried to reproduce what had been at Bell Labs, expand on it, and nothing worked. At Bell Labs, it sometimes worked enough that I could start to do experiments. At MIT, it really did not work. But I had some really great students. So in July of 1990, I spent 6 months sort of banging my head against the wall, trying to do stuff, and it just didn't work. And so we decided we had to reinvent the entire synthesis from scratch, using 2 concepts. One of them is that we had to go to high temperature, because crystals, if you want to have a high quality crystal, you have to be at a temperature that's high enough for the atoms to be able to move around and rearrange and find the right spot so that it crystallizes. Right? Otherwise, you have an amorphous material. The temperature that you need depends on the strength of the bond that it's made out of. If you make your crystal salt at low temperature, because it's easy to dissolve it and form it. For a more covalent crystal, you have to go to high temperature. For silicon, you need to go to 600 degrees Celsius. Turns out for catselenide, we needed to go to about 300 degrees Celsius to be able to rearrange those atoms to a crystal. And the second concept was an old concept in physical chemistry called nucleation and growth, the separation of nucleation and growth to make material that are all really identical. And you know that concept well here in the Boston area, because we're used to snow being different depending on the temperature and the humidity and of the atmosphere. You know, where it's formed. So how does snow form? Snow is seeded in clouds as little tiny seeds of ice, right? And then those little tiny seeds of ice make their way down to the bottom of the earth, and they encounter different temperature and humidity environments. And it's those humidity and temperature environments then that provide the snow that we see, its size, its shape, etc. So if you have a day where the atmosphere is fairly warm, very humid, you end up with very fluffy snowflakes. Right? And it's not like you have a few that are really tiny. They're pretty much all large and fluffy. Right? So you've seeded something tiny, and you've separated the nucleation and the growth, and control the conditions of both the big formal are the same. If it's a blizzard, it's really cold, it's really windy, and it's really dry also at the same time near the earth, you're going to get really tiny snowflakes. So that's the concept. It's not a hard concept. The devil is in the details. How do you apply that concept to a nanomaterial, separate information? And the way we did that was by very simple thing. So we were physical chemists. We were not synthetic chemists. And so I needed to be able to make samples, but I couldn't go through a multiple steps engineered synthesis because I wasn't capable of doing that. And it had to be simple. So we start with metal organic precursors that contain the right atoms that we needed, that were stable at room temperature. But at high temperature, 300 degrees Celsius, they would crack, meaning the bonds would break and release the atoms that we needed to make the crystal. So we had this injection, quick injection, kind of like seeding on the cloud, with little tiny seeds of the semiconductor from the line, followed by a slower growth, where the precursors then start to grow on top of the existing seeds. And that sounds really simple, and that providing a Nobel Prize. But it wasn't as easy as it seemed when I talk about it. There were a lot of trials and errors and finding the right precursors and the right conditions, and characterizing the whole thing, and etc. And it was Chris Murray, David Norris, my first two graduate students, who did this, and that was the first paper that we wrote at MIT when I was an assistant professor. That was my first paper. It was, I started in 1990, published in 1993, so you can say I had a dry period, the first 3 years. But then once we had the paper and we had the material, then it was a gusher of information, because suddenly we had a material that you could make very easily, reproducibly, that you could begin to study with nanomaterials. And there were a couple words in our abstract here that were really important for it turns out. One was the word simple root and a single reaction. And that turned out to be important for making a technology out of it. Because if you want to make a technology, you need to have it inexpensive enough for it to be available. And anything you make, whether it be a semiconductor chip or a chemical reaction or pharmaceutical, the cost is directly proportional to the number of steps that you take. So one step is as inexpensive as you can get, and you're just basically stuck with the cost of the precursors, which if you make them at scale, also become very expensive. And then we had the science-selective precipitation was a way to further narrow the distribution, so that, but it was also a way of purifying. So if you're a chemist, you make a new molecule, the first thing you need to do is purify it, isolate it from everything else, so you can study it. This was a nanomaterial, so we developed a way to purify our nanomaterials so we can study it. Okay, then we started to do physics. We saw some really cool things like these graphs where it's small particles, big particles here. We wanted to know what happens in between atoms and molecules, and then solid state. How does it go from atoms to the solid state? These are your harmonics or your wave here coming apart, so harmonics come together, and then there's some weird things happening here. We call that an avoided crossing. As spectroscopists, and our hearts skip a beat, because this is really exciting if you're doing fundamental spectroscopy and you really discover something really interesting that perhaps nobody else cares about, but really care about it, because it showed us how those electrons are interacting with the atoms, so that liberated electron is interacting with the atoms that are inside the box of those atoms. Now these atoms, these particles are kind of like atoms too. They've got one electron that's sort of liberated, but it's kind of like an electron in an atom. And it turns out if you make all the particles the same size, they crystallize like atoms crystallize, and you can make now crystals of particles, and maybe those have interesting properties. And that's a field that's also exploded as people try to make engineered solids from properties that you can make from individual particles. Just Sherry discovered how to do that. An important milestone was, so the first particles we made, I showed you the prep and the kind of glow that we do, and the efficiency of the glowing light was about 15 to 20%, and it was so much better than it was at Bell Labs because it was 0% at Bell Labs. So to me, that was like, amazing, they're so bright, right? And then I had a colleague in Germany say, yeah, 50%, that means that 85% of your sample is crap. That's a reality check right there. So but the field then realized we can make this better because what we needed to do was to take that quantum dot here and isolate it from the surrounding and then make the surface much better, have a much higher quality surface. Essentially create an M&M, it melts in your mouth, not in your hand, right? And so we made a different kind of material around it. We encapsulate this quantum dot, and that then allowed us to get the quantum dot nearly 100% with these beautiful colors coming out if you shine blue light on them. And then we were chemists, so the first application that came to mind, so as soon as you make a new material that has properties that are different, if you're at MIT or Berkeley or all the others was, surrounded by people that are interested in applications, what can I use it for? The physics is great, the fundamental science is great. We went from curiosity to learning about physics. Wow, what are we going to do with it? And we were chemists, so the first thing we thought about was biology. These are small particles that are the same size as big proteins. And people were using dye molecules to tag cells fluorescently to see the architecture of cells, etc. So we ended up using quantum dots to do the same thing. So the red nucleus of the cell is labeled quantum dots. This is the red cell. The green the skeleton is labeled with the dye molecule. And then if you shine blue light to image both colors at once, you find that the dye molecule reaches out. It sort of loses its properties because it interacts with the light and the oxygen and sort of the bonds break, but the quantum dots are made out of a three-dimensional network of atoms, and so you break one bond, but the atoms have nowhere to go, right? So unlike an organic molecule, you break a carbon-carbon bond and it just kind of falls apart. Much more stable than dye molecules. We then pursued this and did some pretty hero experiments where this is now in vivo, this is in a mouse experiment looking at stem cells, essentially where stem cells are the bone marrow, trying to understand what the environment of a stem cell is. And so you have to find these stem cells. Not so easy, they're very rare, but if you do a multicolor experiment, so you take two different size quantum dots, the red one and the green emitting one, and these are receptors on the cell that are overexpressed in these particular cells, but not in the normal cells. Then you look for yellow. You look for yellow, and you find it here, and then you can study the surrounding, you can study its kinetics. And this is so this is working with groups at NGH. We looked at flow in tumors, for instance. This is one example. So this is a brain tumor, and this is a mouse that has a brain tumor here. And these bright dots are 100 nanometer aggregates of quantum dots. You can see the single aggregates. And what you can see here is the flow directly. You can see the flow in the normal tissue part of the brain and in the tumor here. And it's really, you just see why it's hard to get drugs to be delivered, because the flow is really terrible here, right? And so by being able to visualize it, and then being able to do experiments where you try to change the flow, then you can really understand, what to do maybe therapeutically, again, with process. So these are the kinds of applications that we did in biology. But the really big application was actually not in biology. It ended up being a few years later, again, we were not electrical engineers, we didn't know anything about displays, but pretty soon we decided, maybe we should look at that area. Because MIT, Cambridge, Channel Square, startups, so our students started a couple companies. I had Nanosys in California, this area here, to try to commercialize outside of biology. The first product that came out was actually a light bulb. A light bulb, an LED light bulb in 2010. And if you remember, those of you who were around and thinking about light bulbs, Those were really expensive. They cost about $100 a piece. They had too much blue in them. There was a blue LED with a yellow phosphor, and it looked white, but if you looked at yourself in the mirror in the morning, you looked very gray, because there wasn't enough red in there. The color temperature was too high, and it was missing a bunch of red. But by taking quantum dots and taking some of the blue light and re-emitting it as red light very efficiently, because these now had 100% efficiency in color conversion, we could create a color that was much more like the sun. Right? So we had enough red in it, like an incandescent light bulb. We love incandescent light bulbs. Right? They look like bright, especially if it has a lot of red in them. This feels like we're sitting next to fires. So that was sold on bulbs.com for a while. And the problem is that from a business perspective, that was actually a terrible idea. Because it's good when the bulbs cost $100, and then you can add a little piece to the bulb, and you can get some money. But when the price drops to $5, then maybe you can put 10 cents extra here, but you don't get money. So that computer vision had to shift, find a new way. And the same idea of color shifting is in screens and displays, right? So if you have a television or a screen, how do you make the colors? Well, one of the ways you can do that is by having blue LEDs. That's your source of blue light. Then you can take quantum dots in some fashion, absorb some of the blue, and maybe you have green and red emitting dots here, and now you have red, green, blue in the back of your screen. That's all you need. That's all the human eye has 3 different ways, colors. They can see 3 rods, right? And then that's all the colors of the world that you can see. So these 3 colors. You generate these 3 colors. The first company to commercialize that was Sony, working with computer vision. It was over-engineered. I have one of those still in my house. They were great. It lasted for 1 year, partly because they were using Canon cyanide. Canon is not particularly friendly for humans. Right? It's also a public relation nightmare if you have to explain why you're using Canon and how you're going to get rid of it. Samsung looked at this and thought, wow, this is a really good idea, but we're not going to use Canon. So they spent a lot of time and money developing indium phosphide quantum dots. Another semiconductor, but indium and phosphorus are pretty innocuous elements. So it's all the indium oxide is everywhere, phosphorus is in the body everywhere. And they bought 3D vision. The reason why they bought 3D vision wasn't really because of anything 3D vision had done, but because of the logo. Because 3D vision had copyrighted this logo to Q. And LG was selling televisions that were based on organic hydrogen that are called OLED. You've heard of OLED technology. So this is a way of Samsung sort of differentiating itself with QLED and quantum. It's so much better than O, right? So today, most of the high-end TVs and even the low-end TVs use quantum dots to create colors. And the Samsung OLED TV actually, they use OLED, blue, pixelated OLEDs to create the blue. Then they inkjet print on them the different colors of dots to create the RGB. And you can make the part of the displays now very much brighter. They use less energy per watt coming out, right? More energy efficient. But what the humans do, we create something that's more energy efficient, which is bigger. That's like bigger cars, bigger TVs. Okay, so that's the thing. I'm going to skip a couple of things here, just for you one more application before I finish. So this is an example of cameras that see infrared. So you see night vision, you can see infrared with night vision cameras. It turns out those night vision cameras don't see the visible light very well. They don't see the UV light at all. And so if you want to see both the UV or the visible one and the infrared or night vision at the same time, you need 2 different kinds of cameras, maybe even 3 different kinds of cameras. But it turns out that quantum dots can fix this problem really simply by taking your image plane or your sensor for your camera and coating on top of it quantum dots that absorb all the visible in UV and re-emit their light in the infrared, which is then imaged by the camera. And my students and my collaborator had a great time showing this by setting a scene, put in the 1960s perhaps, a bunch of spies, Soviet spies and American spies. They're trading secret documents, and these are 2 spies trading documents, and they have a suitcase here, a briefcase that's tagged with a UV lamp because another spy is looking at it, wants to keep track of where the secret documents are. They're going to trade briefcases, they're identical briefcases, except for the UV lights, right? So we're looking at the scene, and we can see in my night vision camera the little UV tag on these things because of the quantum dots. Now, this part of the camera is not coated with dots, so one of them then picks up the secret documents and runs across. Clearly see that it's a but in normal night vision camera, you can't see it. Right? A very simple fix. I'm going to end here showing you. These are the lists of my students over the years, 150 of them or so. They got together a couple of years ago. It was a great time. It takes a lot of money. I was lucky to have money from a lot of places, and you'll notice that on the left are the federal funds, on the right are industrial funds, the middle are foundations, and on top is MIT. The fundamental part of my research was all funded by MIT or foundations. And Lou Bruce also was funded by Galad. He also says that he would never have gotten an NSF grant, even back then, to fund his curiosity-driven research. And that was true for me. It wasn't until we were able to actually show the material, high quality, and begin to show real data that we were able to crack the federal funds. And once we got to applications, and we were able to crack the industrial money. Today, most of our money actually comes from industry. And the importance of internal money from the schools and from the foundations is critical to the curiosity part of the work to get us to the technology.
Thank you. Are marvelous talk. Are you able to
Yes.
take some questions? All right, I'll let you call on folks.
Yeah, back there.
So I can envision experimental chemists who are working in a lab with beakers, the kind of things you showed and so on. But you also mentioned theoretical chemists. And I'm kind of wondering how theoretical chemists work. What are they doing on a Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock?
I'm sure we have some theories behind chemists here. Well, I was a theoretical chemist for a while. So, we take data that other experimentalists have gathered, and we try to understand how it comes about. So how do molecules actually, what are their properties? What are the intrinsic physics that create the properties of the molecules of the material? Can we predict their properties? Can we explain what we see? So for the quantum dots, the idea of the wave sort of getting smaller, that's easy to understand. But then you have these weird things happening. The subtle effects that turn out to be extremely important, where the electron interacts with the atoms that are inside the box. How does that come about? That's where we need theorists. To model it on a computer, to model it analytically using mathematics, to go at the fundamental properties of all these atoms and molecules and bringing together to explain to us what the world really is at a microscopic level. Yes.
Fascinating, thank you. I have one question and one small comment. The one question is, back to the early 1980s, you mentioned the independent co-discovery of the quantum size effects. And in some theories of science, there's the idea that it's new technology that triggers a paradigm shift. What do you think what it was in this case? The little comment is about the indium phosphide. This is indeed considered as being probably carcinogenic to humans based on data on cancer in experimental animals and the WHO classification. So
I'll get to the indium phosphide.
not an issue for the consumers, but for those who work in screen manufacturing.
Yes. Yeah. So the technology, the trigger for the discovery of the quantum effect of the quantum size particles was actually that the physicists at Bell Labs in Leningrad, they were working on something we call quantum wells. Quantum wells are thin sheets of semiconductor where the sheet dimension is small enough that you start to see quantum effects. And these quantum wells were being developed, were being investigated at the time to make very efficient lasers, quantum well lasers, that eventually became super important for communication, telecommunication. So the wavelengths at 1.5 micron is all perfectly suited for quantum well lasers, etc. And so both Lewis, Bruce, and Alexei Kimov were surrounded by physicists who were thinking day and night about physics of quantum wells. And that's why they came out with the quantum size effect in the quantum.
Thank you.
The indium phosphide, yes. So there's a European agency called that talks about toxicity.
It's the
ROHS.
International Agency for Research in Cancer, the specialized cancer research arm of the World Health Organization.
Yeah, so the regulations are the ROHS regulations that regulate what you can put in consumer items in the European Union, and ROHS regulations tend to, if you meet that, then you can sell products all over the world pretty much. Right now, indium phosphide doesn't fall under ROHS, but it may in the future. This is definitely something that will be seen. And you're right, it's for the consumer, it's not really an issue, but it is at the industrial level. There are two main providers of quantum dots in the world today. Two huge producers, one in Korea and one in Japan. They need to make their workers safe.
Thanks for talking. I have a couple topical questions, maybe only one of which you'll answer, but the highlighted parts here, you say you got most of your money that led to breakthroughs, but the left-hand side, the tax money, unlike the highlighted side, provides indirect costs, which allows the lights to turn on and the heat to turn on, all that,
Yes.
etc. Topical in the news now because current occupants of Pennsylvania Avenue want to cut that away. I think the best possible vocalists to defend science in America are the likes of yourselves and Nobel Prizes, etc. What are your thoughts on that? On how cutting funding from NSF and NIH and DOE and DARPA, well, maybe not DARPA, they'll probably leave that alone, but basic science, health, and physics and chemistry.
I think it's kind of strong. I think for basically the innovations of today, the science of today, that leads to technology tomorrow. If you don't have that, when you slow it down, you lose the ability to create new technologies. And it's like children, and it's the national security of the country as well. And so basically shooting ourselves.
Well, I think every scientist, technologist, and educated person in the country will agree with that.
Yes.
Which is how do we get those that are, I'll politically say, unfortunately, that are elected now to move towards that side. Maybe you can't answer that.
I don't know how to answer that except to,
Well, we need
to try
we
to
need your
explain.
folks to work with
To
the
try to,
governments.
we have to explain to the general public.
Yeah,
Important stuff.
that's the first place to start.
Um,
Second, very quick question. It's also topical. Microsoft announced today a potential breakthrough in quantum computing.
Yes.
But there's also quantum dots can be key topological quantum dots, which could actually technologically push what they did today much further and faster. Is your group working at TI-type quantum dots, topological, or familiar with the people that are?
So
Do you think
those are
aspects?
different kind of quantum dots, made in a different way.
Absolutely, yeah.
Super interesting science. It's harder for us to look at as carefully as those other kinds of quantum dots. I have interest in quantum computing or through quantum optics for using photons as qubits basically. And our kinds of quantum dots could be interesting sources of quantum light. So that's the route that I'm going in my own research. But we'll see where these other kinds of quantum dots will be really interesting to see.
See if there's some of the students have a question.
Yeah, students in the back maybe.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you think the biggest research questions and avenues for future development for quantum dots are.
Okay, I get asked that a lot. And I've never been one to really look far in the future. I'm not a visionary. I go where it's been a very Edisonian sort of field. I can tell you today that a lot of people are working on photocatalysis, back to the original roots of trying to make fuels from the sunlight. I think there's a lot of progress going on in photocatalysis using quantum dots of all ways, in different kinds of optics, including quantum optics, using the dots, applications and more down-to-earth applications in solar energy harvesting, not in photocatalysis perhaps, but in just downshifting. There's some projects of using quantum dots in very thin sheets of polymer as a way to, in greenhouses, to take blue light from the sun, which isn't as useful for plants maybe because it got too much energy, tuning it into redder light and increasing the yield of crops, for instance. So there are both fundamental directions as well as more applied directions, and there's so many people working in really interesting areas. That I go to conferences, I'm always surprised at all the different ways people work.
Thank you.
So it's really funny that you say you're not a visionary, first of all. But secondly, earlier in your talk, you mentioned you have this aversion to bandwagons. You wanted to go off and do your own thing, essentially. It's funny that you started that also at Bell Labs, industrial R&D site. Also on this page, you see like DuPont. I mean, there was DuPont CR&D at the same time as well. A couple Nobel laureates have come from that as well. There's no real equivalent of that today. So if, hypothetically, you were starting your career this year, or last year perhaps, doing non-bandwagon science, basic science even, where would you go?
So my students ask me that as well. You're right, Bell Labs has disappeared. We know it. DuPont Central R&D has pretty much disappeared as we know it. I tell them, find some group somewhere that's doing something really interesting. Follow your interests, follow your curiosity, follow your interest. Learn something new, and take it from there. You're going to have to probably go to university. Unless you're working in biotech or in computer science, where you have a lot of resources in companies. The startup company that crowds in molecular biology, right? It's doing some really, really interesting stuff as well. The same thing for the tech labs.
I'm curious if you could comment on, so you described your career path from statistical mechanics to doing spectroscopy on simple molecules in vacuum essentially, and then you chose this quantum dot problem, and you described that interested you, and you described how you got into it. But I'm curious, what gave you the confidence, based on the background that you had, that you can, contribute in that and be successful the way you have been, right? Especially with the synthesis. It's not an obvious.
I had no confidence. I didn't have the confidence. It wasn't a thing about confidence. So the synthesis, it was survival. Right? I mean, I came at MIT. I was supposed to do all these physics experiments, and I didn't have any samples. And I just saw my career path just disintegrating in front of me. I needed samples, and I had some great students, and we tried a bunch of things, and they came out. But it wasn't a matter of having confidence. It was basically needing to do it for survival. And in a way, I go back to my childhood. I didn't have confidence in any place on my own. So that's why I said I'm not really a visionary. It's really, I'm looking at the present and what are the challenges right now, and it's really interesting, and let's fix it. Let's overcome those challenges. Like whether it's an application in biology. When you think about it, that would be pretty cool. But then the short-term stuff is you've got a whole bunch of problems to fix. In order to do that, I think that humans have a very hard time in seeing the past three years. We have a very hard time really knowing what happens in 5 years from now.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering if you know any side effects of like quantum dots in the human body. Like, could they be used to like observe human, like maybe brain cells, like glial cells?
Right. So all the work that we've done is in animal models. I don't think I would want to inject myself. There are many challenges to using small particles in the human body. Iron oxide is one thing that could be applied to humans. Iron oxide is benign. And we need to really understand what happens to these kinds of nano-materials in the human better. That's going to cost a lot more money than it's going to cost.
One last question for you, if I may. You talked about sort of intellectual journey, including early forays into astrochemistry and astrophysics, I guess. Can you talk a little bit about how the way you went about that science, what you learned in doing that science, may have informed the way you continue to be a scientist going forward?
Well, my beginning of my journey zeroed me in on the magic of quantum mechanics. So I started doing statistical mechanics. And that was, to me, hard math, and I wasn't very well suited to it. But astrophysics or astrochemistry is looking at molecules, and small molecules, using spectroscopy, that was much more suited to me. And the part that I loved about it was the quantum mechanics aspect of understanding the vibrations and rotations of these molecules in cold, interstellar space. The chemistry of interstellar space, although really super important, was not something that I could intuit very well. But that was where the interest really was, was in that chemistry. And so when I discovered quantum dots, that was much more to my liking, to what I could do. I see what the astrochemistry is today. It's really incredible, but I couldn't do it. This I can do.
All right, any parting words before we end today?
Stay curious.
All right, let's have a